Welcome back to Be Lifted Up, your guide to living an abundant life. I'm Alfred Edmond Jr. with DC Marshall, and we're here to talk about resilience. We're talking about resilience in the aftermath of the pandemic. We're talking about the resilience in the wake of new impending economic challenges, including a predicted recession, rising interest rates, changes in the job market. And this, Dee, I think is really an important topic because for me, it's one of the real great environments for growth of faith. I literally just posted on my Instagram and Facebook today that, recession, they say, I say, but God. And I noted that this will be my 9th recession since I was born. The year I was born into a recession. The year Black Enterprise was founded was during a recession, and there's been recessions since then. And while those are challenging times, those are also challenging times to reinforce our sense of faith, because God comes through. God comes through all the time. So I know this is a conversation I think is an important one as we not only come out of the challenges we've just been through these last couple of years, but as we look at some of the changes that are facing us right now.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. And, I will say this, I think the conversation around resiliency, and I know you've heard me share this before, but I anchor back to the theme that I started with at the beginning of the pandemic. It was January of 2020. I've shared this before. I made a definitive decision to disrupt myself. And little did I know, not only was my life going to be disrupted, but all of our lives were going to be disrupted. But one of the things that really helped me to stand strong, and this is in addition to my faith, me being a woman of faith, and the thing that I shared with others was, we're coming out of this. We are coming out. We are not going to die, or at least not just yet, and not necessarily from a recession. We're coming out. So always having perspective is necessary. So I think that's the first piece, is just really having perspective. And the 3 words that sort of was the beginning of the pandemic for me was, okay, be careful first, number 1, and then number 2, be grateful, and number 3, be prayerful. Or if we reverse it, number 1, always start with prayer, be prayerful, trust God. Trust God, because even our posture to a recession gives an indication of, are we believers, believing in God, or the idea of God and not believing God? Because I believe there are believing believers, like those who believe God and believe in God. And then there are some people who just believe in the idea of God, but don't believe God in terms of God's promises to keep us, to protect us, and so on and so forth. So yes, this conversation around resiliency is about being prayerful, number 1, be careful, number 2, and be grateful. And so that's really where I anchor, even going into potentially another, and I'm going to call it another pandemic within a pandemic, if in fact we are on our way into a recession. So that's my 2 cents.
Well, your 2 cents is worth a lot more than 2 cents. I'm reminded of the scripture, build your hope on things eternal. The economy is fluctuating. Everything else fluctuates. Everything else is temporary. Everything else changes. So if you're building your hopes on things eternal, which means not just believing in God, but believing God, then you're already positioned to navigate whatever storms and changes are coming. That, by the way, includes opportunities as well as challenges. Well, listen, guys, we have the perfect guest to have this conversation. I'm talking about global strategist, best-selling author, Dr. Cindy Trimm, trained in strategic leadership at Oxford, a former senator, just versed in both corporate governance and corporate issues, as well as just broader economic issues, and most importantly, a thought leader and respected business and life strategist. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Trimm. It's so great to have you.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited. I'm excited about the topic of resilience.
Well, as we jump into this conversation, Dr. Trimm, tell our audience more about the journey that you've taken to become Dr. Cindy Trimm. You're a best-selling author. I know you have, I think, a new book called Unstoppable, which is a great mindset to have in this environment. Compete with your best self and win. But let's give our audience a little context about your perspective on this topic and the journey that you took to get that perspective.
Yeah, I grew up in abject poverty. I actually was in an environment, I was surrounded by middle to upper class in terms of income. But we were the poorest of poor. We were the poor family. We were the typical face of the Salvation Army brand, literally. And that was my humble beginnings. And through a series of unfortunate situations, death, my mother lost her parents by the time she was 9. And she raised, her younger siblings. And then my father abandoned my mother after, of course, having 7 kids. So this is like a double, triple whammy. And she had to navigate that terrain. And I think why, the whole topic of resilience is important, because I watch my mother. That was an example. And a lot of times we're looking for tools. But I think one of the greatest tools that we have is creating this ecosystem around us called relationships. So I watched my mother demonstrate what resilience looked like. And then a series of life crises happened to me. And that life crisis is where I really learned to change the narrative of my life, where I discovered that I was the leading actress. I wasn't waiting for a Superman or a superwoman or a superhero. I was that superhero, and that I had these superpowers. And one of the superpowers that I had was the ability to think. I discovered that where I end up tomorrow is as a result of the sum total of the thoughts that I had yesterday. And that at any given moment in my life, if my life is not going in the direction that I wanted it to go, I was not a victim. I was actually the creator of my reality. And then I discovered that, I actually was casted as the lead role, or in the lead role, in the unfolding of my own life. So I stepped out of the shadows, and I decided that I was not going to participate in poverty. And it was a decision that I definitely made. And redefining my life actually resurfaced my destiny. So a lot of times people are looking for secrets or looking for something outside of themselves to change. But when you change on the inside, and when you have the courage to reframe the narratives of your life actually takes on a different kind of texture and tone. And the question that I always ask, could things be the way they are? Because you are the way you are. And what one thing can you change that can change everything? And you could change the way you think about yourself. And you could change the orientation that you have towards yourself and the orientation you have towards the world. And I figured out by the time I was 8 years old that this world was filled with abundance, and I could be a part of it.
Wow.
Dr. Trimm, can you go a little deeper on how does an 8-year-old girl, become aware or tap into that level of depth at 8 years old? I think that is so powerful. I've heard you share your story before, so I'd love to know, 8 years old, how does that happen? Where did that come from?
I think out of necessity. Again, we believe the stories we tell ourselves. And because I grew up in a home where my mother never spoke negatively about our condition. So she always said, life is about decisions that you make. And I made a decision. She asked, okay, Cindy, what do you want to do? Do you want to go piano? Do you want to do ballet? What do you want to do as extracurriculum? So I figured, well, why do I have to choose one? I want to do everything. I want to do bowling, photography, ballet, piano. I want to do everything. And her answer was okay, but I understood that okay simply meant you have to figure out how you're going to do it. And so that's when I started my first business. I started my first business because we had a problem. And I think, if there's one thing that I can say to people, that there is prospering power in a problem. The bigger the problem, the greater the opportunity you have to look within for the solution. And so problems don't come to create duress. They come to expose what we have on the inside. And just through, people ask me all the time, well, how did you do it at 8? How did you do it at 17? I think because we inherently, like there's this innate force that lets us know we know the terrain of our destiny. And it's connecting to that. I call it the God whispers. Believing that your daydreams are possible and your desires are possible. But I only had an 8-year-old mind, and my 8-year-old mind said, I can do this. But because I knew there was no money in the house, I didn't give up on myself, and I didn't give up on my dreams. And that's what self-efficacy is all about. And I think teaching the next generation, we're always going to have problems. There's always going to be a recession. There's always going to be a challenge. But those, I think, problems and challenges point you towards two things: purpose and potential.
Awesome. Well, hold it right there. We are going to come back on the other side of the break. Everybody, it's Be Lifted Up, your guide to living an abundant life.